With all the talk of the refugee crisis happening in Syria, it's hard to remember sometimes, at least for some people, politicians in particular, that there's also a war going on, a war against terrorist thugs, a war against a movement that wants to spread their caliphate around the world. One man that knows that all too well is Stephen Coughlin. He used to work with the Pentagon. He used to give briefings known as the Red Pill briefings. We'll ask him what that is in a little bit. But Stephen Coughlin will be coming to Canada. We'll give you details shortly. But September 16th, if you're in the Montreal area, September 17th, if you're in the Ottawa area. And he joins me now from Virginia. Mr. Coughlin, thanks for taking the time. I want to get to some of your recent writings about what ISIS really wants. But with this refugee crisis going on, we're in the middle of an election campaign. Canada is being pushed to accept more refugees, which we will. I think that there are legitimate refugees there. But the Prime Minister Harper did raise the issue of security concerns. And he's been accused of fear-mongering, saying, well, they're all good refugees. This is just fear-mongering. Do Western countries have to be worried that this real humanitarian crisis is going to be exploited by the likes of ISIS and others?
Well, first of all, I'd like to agree with you that there are some bona fide refugees in these mix. But, I was just coming over from being in Cairo the last couple of days, and even the Egyptians were kind of like taken back by the exploitation of the refugee issue on the media, by especially when we were there, we were watching CNN International, and it was round the clock, total coverage of a poor little kid who drowned to death. And the point was that they were pointing out that a high percentage of these refugees are not women with children, they're young men. And
the United Nations' own report yesterday was saying 72% men.
72% men, and I'm thinking that 72% of them are young men. And you're finding on these border incidences a lot of brutality within these refugee camps. Secondly, it's the UN that's making a decision who constitutes a refugee, and it's not lost on me that they may be counting a lot of the Brotherhood people, a lot of the Brotherhood fighters who are on the losing side of some of these battles as refugees. Now, for those who might want to contest what I'm saying, I think I win the argument when it turns out that nobody's even discriminating on that question for bringing people in. There's something about this group of refugees that doesn't fit the profile of depopulated women and children.
Well, yeah, let me just correct something. That UN report that said 72% men, that was of the migrants crossing either the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea, the people arriving by boat. And they may not be refugees at all. They're just showing up on Europe's doorstep and saying, take us.
Well, I'm hearing that they're not only saying on doorstep, take us, they're demanding it and getting into some, pretty physical fights. I've had people talk to me, and they've sent me things that used to be on YouTube clip about refugees. It's not making is no longer on YouTube. And I don't want to sound conspiracy theorist, but I do think it's fair to say that the media is exploiting this issue, and I don't think we're getting a clear picture of what's going on.
Yeah, well, starving children and women in desperate situations, one thing, but a bunch of fighting-age men leads me to worry that it is a real security threat.
And that's my concern. And the very fact that you'll be attacked for raising that point raises a question for me.
Let's talk about the overall issue of the ongoing war on terror. You've been at this since, I believe, before 9/11, but you were sent over to work with the Pentagon shortly after 9/11 because of what you knew. It's 15 years later, almost 15 years later. Have we learned enough, or are we still putting our heads in the sand about what the real issue is, which will bring me in a second to your red pill briefing?
Well, actually, when I got mobilized in 2001, September 2001, I came from the private sector. My background was international law and international business in the publishing world. And I assumed when I got brought on to the Joint Staff Intelligence that I was going to have a huge catch-up curve to catch up to, and started to realize that people were just talking points generated to get by that day's brief. As a person who had a background in international law, I had some experience with Sharia law when I had to do a copyright infringement case in the Middle East, in a Muslim country. And I kept saying, guys, there really is such a thing as Islamic law. It isn't just the trees and the flowers in the sky. There's published bodies of law, and this is who are the people who declare hostility to us. This is what they say they follow. Mm-hmm. And it's then that I started to realize that we were not looking at that body of knowledge. And to me, it's one of these things where if you're doing intelligence, the number one objective of intelligence is to know the enemy. And at the first blush, on the first analysis, the enemy is always who he says he is. And if he says he fights according to green cheese, and that's his doctrine, and because of that he's killing Americans or Canadians, then you have a duty to know the enemy by knowing his doctrine, which is green cheese. It doesn't matter whether you like it. It doesn't matter whether they're wrong because it's really blue cheese. It doesn't even matter if you don't like cheese, so you prefer to talk about granola. The fact is, threat analysis is about who the enemy says and who he says his doctrine is. That is so critically important because it's from that you can create estimations. So let's just say we do an analysis, a fact-driven analysis, that the enemy in fact says he fights jihad. Jihad according to Islamic law. It is a fact that he says he does it according to Islamic law to implement Islamic law. My view is any intelligence product that doesn't account for the self-declared basis of a self-declared enemy threat doctrine is deficient for that reason. And I think in a court of law, you could say it reaches malpractice.
You reminded me as you were talking there about people not wanting to acknowledge what's in front of them. You reminded me of going down to the White House a couple of years ago. I was covering Prime Minister Harper making an appearance with President Barack Obama. And the two men, this is the first time they're giving news conferences after the start of the Arab Spring. It hadn't spread all over the place yet. It had been in Tunisia and Egypt, but it hadn't spread everywhere. And we already knew at that point that Muslim Brotherhood elements were central to what was happening in Egypt. And when President Obama was asked about it, it was like he was wishing all his good thoughts would just come true, as he talked about how Mubarak must go and all of this. Prime Minister Harper's answer, a bit more realistic. He said, hey, we'd love to have democracy there, but we're worried about some of what we see, and we're worried about respect for rule of law, minorities, including women and religious minorities. All of that absent from President Obama. It was hopes and wishes and unicorn dreams. And I think that's still going on as we look at the fight against ISIS, as we look at the refugee situation, at all of this. There is a refusal to admit that when, as you say, when the enemy says, here is what I am, there's a refusal to admit that. And they say, no, here's what they are.
Well, I can't answer your question without recalling in my own mind that it was in late summer 2010. Of course, the Arab Spring started off in force in mid-February 2011. That we were keeping track of Inspire magazine. The first edition of Al Qaeda's English language periodical came out, where they said there are those groups among us who want to stay in Mecca, and it's time to go to Medina. And we were saying, look, this is Al Qaeda saying it's time to go to war. And then we saw the replacement of a guy named Akef as the the supreme guide of the Brotherhood with a man named Badia, and he started making very, very warlike statements to the point where by September of 2010 we basically said he declared war. So we said, and I was briefing on Capitol Hill, that the entire Middle East was coming down. It was going to look like a peace and granola effort on the surface, and from the beginning and at all points it was a Brotherhood operation. And that, of course, that needs some explanation and clarification, but and that's what it was. And given that the Brotherhood seems to have such a dominant position inside our national security establishment, it's not surprising that either by working with them or being taken in by their narrative of democracy, as they wanted to explain it, our national leaders became blind. One of the questions I was openly asking and briefing is, how is it that starting with Egypt, and especially when you looked at Libya, we changed sides in the war on terror, and our people didn't seem to understand that we did?
Well, exactly. It's one of the reasons that I was opposed to. I support bombing ISIS in terms of helping Kurds and in pushing back these barbaric thugs that have declared the caliphate. But the mission to Libya, if you looked at it, Gaddafi was a bad guy, but we switched sides and said we will help the people that are going to be on the side of the Brotherhood in the end. And we also, the Western countries were supporting the Brotherhood in Egypt, wrongly.
Well, absolutely. In fact, I was just in a discussion with a gentleman from Libya when I was in Cairo, and some other Arabs, Egyptians, and the question was, what you're talking about. Gaddafi did what Bush demanded. He got rid of his weapons, and he was the biggest killer of Al-Qaeda of the Arab countries. And so the question was, how is the Muslim world to perceive America when, if you're not on their side, they might attack you, and if they back you completely? Because Gaddafi, regardless of what you think about Gaddafi, and there's a lot not to like about him, he did what we asked him to do, and that put him in the, if you will have, the protected zone. So for us to just do a 180 on him, it leaves potential allies in a situation where they're asking, why would we ever want to do that? I mean, it truly is mystifying. And and part of the mystification is, so I make this bipartisan, it was as much people like McCain as it was Obama who seemed not to be troubled by the 180 they did on that whole thing. And I just, how do you explain this?
It's puzzling to me, other than, much like the refugee situation now, and to keep linking it back, because I see us making the same mistakes, there was a media campaign of we've got to do something, regarding the so-called rebels and freedom fighters in Libya, just as there is a we've got to do something media campaign on now. And politicians are not leaders, they're followers, and if there's enough noise, they'll try and get in front of that parade.
Well, I think you're hitting on something there, and this is a huge shift that I'm advocating, which is we no longer do analysis based on facts. We don't do analysis based on national interest. Clearly, the Egyptians were saying there is no way to rationalize what you are doing with this Iran treaty with anything that could be by a third party understood to be rational. It's not in your national interest to do this, and therefore they think there might be some secret conspiracy. I'll leave that aside. But I think you're onto something, and that is this, that we need to understand that what drives our political systems in the West is narratives. And we need to start taking account of what these narratives are and who's driving them, because you're either driving a narrative or you're following one. And I think we're living in a period where the people driving narratives are doing it for money, ratings, or they're doing it for the purposes of undermining legitimate Western democratic values. And
I think coming out of the universities over several decades, there is a default position, a soft left default position that says other societies are always better than the West. And I think that's part of why Western journalists buy into these narratives that come from outside that are against our national interest, that are against our civilizational interests.
And of course, this starts with the 1978 or 79 publication of Edward Said's Orientalism. And that's what kicked that whole narrative off. At the time, he was a literature professor, then became the guru of Middle Eastern studies, and that's where you have this interesting discussion about the other. The other. It's always the other, and we have to understand the other. But what that's really translating into is whatever the other believes should take priority in your culture against your own beliefs. So it's turning out that the other is used not to respect people with foreign backgrounds, from a Western perspective, not to have an understanding, but to use them to deconstruct Western values inside the Western domain. And I think we need to start taking account of that. When you are in an intelligence operation and your leaders say, we have no right to look at Islam, when the enemy says he fights according to Islamic law, you're talking to a person as an American who put his fear of violating racism, sexism, homophobia standards, Islamophobia standards, over and above his oath to support and defend the Constitution. And that's where we are. And I think we have to start understanding that this is truly a clear and present and existential threat. And if we don't get our hands around it, the West will fall.
Stephen Coughlin is an intelligence analyst. He formerly briefed the Pentagon until he got too close to the real issue, the issue that they didn't want to deal with, and was pushed out. He's coming to Montreal on September 16th to give a talk there, and Ottawa September 17th to give a talk. If you are in the area, I highly recommend you dropping by. Stephen, some of your talks going back to your Pentagon days have been dubbed the Red Pill Briefing. Fill us in on what that is before we go.
Well, what happened is I did become very contrarian inside the Pentagon, so much so that I would have people, sometimes generals, because I'm this lowly major from the reserves, for gosh sake, and I think some of your Canadian military personnel will have a sense for what I'm talking about, a little bit.
Yep.
But and I would challenge the paradigm, but I was thinking, look at. I'm a fully qualified intelligence officer. I have the master's degree from the National Defense Intelligence College, which only the top 10% get. And I'm an attorney, and I'm telling you this is law, and I'm telling you that if you don't take this into account, you will suffer. So I started making an analysis. I wrote a thesis on this in 2007, which we're going to release as a book very soon, because it cleared the DIA and CIA and DOD. I basically put these briefs together, and when the special operations people started seeing these briefs, they dubbed it the Red Pill Brief from the movie The Matrix. And what it was, look, I don't care if you agree with this brief or disagree with it when you leave. Give me 3 months and let's see what happens. And they said, this is the Red Pill Brief, Steve, because once you take it, everything changes. And of course,
you can't go back.
You can't go back. And it's this. My briefs have been made to try with an eye toward the rules of evidence. If I put a data point down there, I try to make sure it's a primary source, one that speaks to a fact, and the fact that can survive political theories and stated policies. People say, Steve, our policy is not to look at that. And my answer is, then the policy is to systematically look past facts. So what happened is these briefs became very popular, and they became very popular not just because they were Red Pill briefs, but because they answered questions that the combatant commanders, the fighters, the war fighters saw. So much so that when I would go to the senior military schools, the Army War College, National Defense University, and especially the Joint Forces Staff College and a couple others, what would happen is there would be a break, and a colonel, it would usually be an Army colonel or a Marine Corps colonel who just came off of regimental or brigade command, and they would be angry. And I would say, oh my God, what's going on here? Why are you so mad? And they would say, had I had this brief when I was in command in Iraq or in Afghanistan, I would have troops who are still alive. And I still get people who respond that way when they see these briefs. So I know that when I give these people to special agents who are on the ground or to officers who are in direct contact with the enemy abroad, I know that they know this is right. And this then raises the question from my book, Catastrophic Failure, of what happens at the major level for training officers, that officers who come in being very good, we start to see a selection process that values narrative enforcers over fact analyzers.
I think I'd prefer the latter.
Yes, because guess what? Your life depends on it.
All right, Stephen, we're going to wrap it there, but thanks so much for your time today, and looking forward to hearing. I'll be in Calgary when you're in Ottawa, but I'm looking forward to hearing reports back and watching the video of the event. Thanks so much.
It is a pleasure. Take care.
All right, and of course you can find out all the details below this video and where you can get tickets for Stephen Coughlin's talk on the Red Pill Brief.